Welcome, everyone. I'm excited for today's conversation. Good afternoon. I am the co-director of the Women in Public Policy program, Hannah Riley Bowles. I'm honored to co-direct the program with Iris Bonet. Welcome to our fall research seminar. The seminar this semester is focused on exploring work and family. We are hearing from thought leaders in the space of research related to managing the boundaries of work and family, exploring how institutions, policies, social norms, behavioral choices shape our ability to thrive in both realms. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Erika Bachiochi. She is going to present on the duty of the moment, learning from pre-industrial home work integration. Erika is a professor of the practice and director of the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative for Women in Civic Life and Thought at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Erika works at the intersection of legal and political theory, constitutional law, women's history, care feminism, and Catholic social teaching. I learned from every conversation with Erika. I'm delighted you're joining us today. Thank you. Erika is the author of The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, and editor-in-chief of the online journal Fairer Disputations. She is going to be presenting ideas from existing work and also going to be trying out with us some ideas for a new book project. So she will talk about the conflict between responsibilities at home and at work, asserting that it is largely a result of economic transitions to which we have still not adequately responded nearly a century after industrialization. She will present for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So please be ready to put your questions in the chat space, and then if we're able, we're going to get as many of you as possible unmuted and able to ask your questions directly. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Erika. Thank you very much, Erika. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Hopefully everyone can hear me in my little AirPods. And it's really a delight and an honor to be with you, especially being invited by you, Hannah. I've really enjoyed our conversations over the years, albeit always via Zoom. So we'll have to get together at some point. So I am zooming in from actually outside of Boston, not too far from Harvard itself, and just really thrilled to be here and to be talking about all of this. So I'm going to share my slides. And then shrink everything else. Okay. So the conflict between work and family in our day is a problem in need of a fix. Though we debate about public solutions that might ease the conflict, we still generally leave each parent to resolve the disharmony on his or her own. But the conflict itself, I want to underscore in this presentation, is historically contingent. Before the Industrial Revolution, nearly all work was domestic work, engaged in as interdependent members of economically productive households. Now, I, for one, am extraordinarily grateful for the many technological advances of the industrial era, as well as for the rights of women and enslaved persons that emerged in that era, too. Without these, of course, I would not be introducing you, addressing it, any of you this afternoon. But given how very naughty the work family dilemma has been in our time, I want to go back, way back, actually, before the industrial era cleaved work from home. I want to see what kinds of lessons we might learn from that time to bring back to our own. I want to propose in particular what I take to be three humanizing principles from Aristotle's observations about the primacy of the pre-modern household and the cultivations of the virtues within it. I think we're going to have a very hard time retaining our humanity in this high-tech age if we can't see clearly what was lost of that humanity in addition to all that was gained since that last technological revolution of this depth and scale. So I have divided my lecture this afternoon into three parts. First, I want to advance my slide. First, I want to contextualize our contingent moment and suggest some provocative reasons why I think we haven't made as much headway on work-family conflict as we might have liked. Second, I want to briefly address why we should care at all about what Aristotle thinks about the household, given his observations about women. And finally, I want to draw out three principles from Aristotle's thought, principles that I think offer guidance for responding more humanely to our work family dilemmas today. So, first, our contingent present. Second, introducing Aristotle and two female thinkers who appropriate his thought. And finally, three Aristotelian principles for humane work family integration. And then after these provocations, I'm very eager to take your questions. Okay, so I am, of course, not making an original point when I observe the basic historical fact that industrialization created the sharp cleavage we see today between home and work, between care of children and the goods of the home on the one hand, and productive remunerative labor on the other. But I do think this fact is worth belaboring to understand just how unique our time is in the history of the world, and to further understand perhaps why this rift has been so very difficult for us to successfully surpass. In 1944, the great political economist Karl Polanyi famously described the period of industrialization as the great disembedding of economic relations from social life. Polanyi observed that profit motive in the increasingly global market economy had begun to take precedence over social relations of mutual obligation, trust, and reciprocity that had for centuries empowered more local markets to flourish. Much commentary, both before and since, has focused on the alienation of labor from capital as a consequence from this time. From mutual care and reciprocity in apprenticeships and local guilds to increasing global competition among machines, we could say that our economy is no longer, in the post-industrial period, human-sized. The skilled craftsman or woman now has to compete against our whole interconnected world. While all of this is true, less attention, I think, has been paid to the additional fact that before industrialization, most work was also a family affair, truly human sized because conducted in and around the family household. So, although now conceptually and so often practically distinct, work and family were once spheres of life that totally permeated each other. As late as 1810, for example, 90% of all textile production in the US emerged from family households, and especially the women of those households who so often performed this remunerative labor with children underfoot. The alienation suffered as a result of this rift, then, were not just among those we today think of as economic actors, say the skilled laborer against the capitalist machine, but within and between the members of economically productive households as well. To underscore the point, care for children and remunerative work were not in conflict as they tend to be today. And so, though men and women in that long period of human history engaged in perhaps different kinds of work, often based on differences of upper body strength and fine motor dexterity, they rarely worked in totally separate spheres. As Aristotle observed more than two millennia ago, the household was the main sphere of life. Indeed, it was also the largest sphere of life in his time and for centuries after. Economics was originally and is etymologically the management of that largest sphere of the pre-modern world, the household. So, though women were legally subordinate to men at that time, and with some notable monarchical exceptions excluded from politics too, women could hardly have been regarded as mere dependents on their husbands when the clothing for their whole family was spun by their hands, as one noted historian describes the point. If we can say then that men generally ruled the political, women have always been essential actors in the economic, in the management of their households, or as important members of others' households, and well beyond the household too, in robust local markets that emerged as the Middle Ages wore on. And children were hardly absent from that work. It's industrialization and drawing remunerative work out of the home, and so men and then women with it, that left us with a crisis of nurture, a crisis of caregiving that still we haven't been able to resolve. In his 1965 book, The World We Have Lost, English historian Peter Laslett describes the presence of children in and around the household before the industrial age. To quote him, in the pre industrial world, there were children everywhere, playing in the village streets and fields when they were small, and then hanging in the farmyards and getting in the way until they had grown enough to be given child sized jobs to do. He continues, The perpetual distraction of childish noise and talk must have affected everyone almost all the time, except, of course, the gentleman in his study or the lady in her boudoir. Incessant interruptions to answer questions, quieten fears, rescue from danger, and make peace between quarreling. And yet, Laslet says, the crowds and crowds of little children and the method of their nurture are mysteriously missing from much of the written record. They are simply assumed. As the mother of many children myself, the nature of whose work has allowed me to prioritize their care in our home for the last 20 plus years, this particular description of Laslet's, of noise and interruptions and child-sized jobs, is strikingly familiar to me. But I think it became more familiar for many more women and men too during the recent pandemic. This period seemed to cause many of us to think more deeply about the conflictual nature of work and home as they had been handed down to us, and perhaps about new possibilities too. My own thinking at that time was animated by what I've just described, the historically contingent nature of this rift between what we now call home and work. I was finishing a book on the history of women's rights, and the cleavage the industrial era caused between care of children and remunerative work figured prominently within it. In the book, I was seeking to uncover the various ways that women's rights advocates had responded to reproductive asymmetry, by which I mean the biological reality that men and women engage in the same sexual act, but that female bodies take on the burden and privilege of bearing any children that result. Given the female body's capacity for breastfeeding as well, women throughout human history have usually served as the primary caregivers of infants and young children too. In my telling of the history, the first and second waves of the women's movement represent distinctive responses to reproductive asymmetry in light of this industrializing rift. The first wave, in my view, worked to humanize the consequences of that technological revolution through moral and legal advocacy for women and children. The second wave pushed forward technological solutions in an effort to equalize those asymmetries instead. But in my way of seeing things, reproductive asymmetry, or the definitionally distinctive reproductive capacities of males and females, is a constant throughout human history, and indeed that which makes human life possible at all. As Aristotle himself observed, females reproduce inside themselves, males outside. But the social, economic, familial conditions in which we human beings are born and in which we raise our children too, and the political meanings we make out of all of these things, those are the historical variables, different in time and in place, and worthy of our deep reflection. And so, as we often see in times of great conflict and war as well, the Industrial Revolution brought the reproductive embodied asymmetries of men and women into sharp relief. No longer could most mothers move in and out moment by moment between the care of young children and the highly skilled household work in which they were so often engaged. No, as women's production and management of many of the goods of the household, food and clothing most obviously, but others too, became with industrialization the province of the machine, the market, and now men's wages too, the household, and the very meanings of home and work were utterly transformed. That largest, most productive sphere of pre-modern life shrunk to a symbol of feminine respite from the industrial economy, and in time was transformed into the chief consumer for the global economy. As a result of the same, women at home with children experienced more and more economic dependence upon their wage earning husbands, an economic dependence that it's important to see was itself historically contingent. The 19th century women's movement in the main then sought humanizing responses to this altogether new solution. The mainstream of that movement pushed back too on the deracinating forces of this new political economy. It was an economy that seemed to want to draw all relations, including familial relations, and indeed child laborers, into the economizing logic of the market. As such, the very first, sorry about that, not sure what just happened. There we go. As such, The very first legal reforms the early women's movement sought were to property law, to duly recognize women's contribution in the household through joint property ownership, so they might hold equal title with their husbands. The early movement's efforts to respond morally and legally to the industrial rift continued in a century of internal debates over labor policy. These resulted in key provisions in FDR's New Deal, as well as decades later, basic anti discrimination measures to protect women's opportunity for paid labor outside the home. Always, the early movement viewed parents and especially mothers' nurturing and educative work in the household to be the most culturally essential and important work there was, that for which all paid labor by mother or father was done. Indeed, even as late as 1966, in the original statement of purpose for the National Organization for Women, we see this early vision nicely articulated. The statement's authors, Polly Murray and Betty Friedan, urged not only anti discrimination law, which Murray's acolyte, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, would, as a litigator, successfully pursue, but now, the organization in 1966 equally urged the nation to, quote, innovate new social institutions which will enable women to enjoy true equality of opportunity and responsibility in society without conflict with their responsibilities as mothers and homemakers. The statement wished not only for a true partnership between the sexes, but also for societal recognition of the economic and social value of homemaking and childcare, quoting the document again. But more than a half century later, the making of homes and the nurture and formation of children within them enjoys even lower status than in 1966. And if social media is any indication, the true partnership between the sexes is a bit on the rocks right now. Indeed, work family conflict is named year after year to be a chief stress in many parents' lives. And among the named reasons, fewer young women are interested in pursuing motherhood at all. So here's my first provocation, or the chief reason I don't think we've made as much headway in solving the work family dilemma as we should have a half century on. In my view, the women's movement was radically diverted from that early humanizing vision when it began to focus, like a laser shot, on securing liberal abortion rights above nearly anything else. Women's rights, in this country at least, have become nearly synonymous with abortion rights. Now, I'm not claiming that those who hold pro abortion rights views are not themselves simultaneously working for better work family integration. Clearly, many, many are. I've personally learned a great deal in this arena from feminist scholars who would disagree with me on the merits of liberal abortion access for women's flourishing. And I want to bracket altogether the distinct matter of ending a pregnancy as a medical procedure for a grave medical complication. The chief point I want to make in this context is that the focus on liberal abortion rights as the sine qua non for equality with men was, in my view, a major misstep that has slowed progress for women and for men who have or wish to have children. Why? Well, the legally privileged opportunity to obtain an abortion for any reason, including the most named reason because of financial need, has allowed the modern economy over the last 50 years to build itself not around the complex needs of families and the children in their care, as now originally envisioned. Instead, the emphasis on abortion as a chief aid in women's capacity to participate in market work has capitulated to, rather than challenged, the modern market's preference for unencumbered workers. That is to say, that relatively liberal abortion access, as long protected by Roe and now by several state constitutions, alongside free contraception, egg freezing, and the like, allows businesses to cheaply ensure that women will be available to meet the all encompassing needs of the global market. Or, to quote consultants who urge this path, to offer high impact benefit with low cost investments. It's no surprise that real workplace integration, pregnancy and motherhood and engaged fatherhood too, are off the corporate table, even if accommodations are officially offered to employees. In practice, as so many parents and especially mothers know, the logic of the market and profit margin rules. And so, against the 19th century movement's universal opposition to abortion and its humanizing desire to work for a society that puts women and families' needs first, the modern feminist movement tended instead to subordinate the family's needs to the markets through promoting reproductive technologies instead. That way, women could more easily, though never perfectly, take their place alongside the unencumbered male worker whom the market preferred. As I'll soon discuss, there's a long tradition in the West of preferring the male embodied form over the female, of regarding the male as the human norm. Up on the screen, and there's going to be many times in this presentation where I'm putting text up and I'm not going to read the text. It's more of like a footnote for you. But this is a woman, Feminist for Life was actually a break off from National Organization for Women when they went for abortion on demand. And here's one of its leaders from New Zealand making the point I just made. And so for decades now, we've been stuck in what I take to be a male normed impasse. In this impasse, the political right has assumed a separate spheres model in which all working parents have a wife at home, and the political left has assumed high quality institutional childcare would satisfy all parents' needs. Market work in both these models is king. Those who day in and day out give priority to the goods of the household, especially care of young children, are left faceless, wanting in dignity in the second, subordinate, indeed inferior place. So I think it's time to think outside the box, to push past ideologies of left and right, and to ask, as I do in my recent book, what if we're just looking at the whole thing upside down? After all, people from across the political spectrum remain deeply unsatisfied with our post-industrial division of labor. And both sides of the political debate on these questions, it seems to me, have strong complaints. Progressives tend to point to still poor workplace accommodations for parents and the second shift at home for which women seem disproportionately responsible. Meanwhile, conservatives tend to prioritize the work of the home and point to that work's low cultural status and want of economic security. And fathers across the political spectrum wish for far more time with their kids. All of this can be true at once, and I think it is. And this has become because it seems to me that our politics on both left and right has been stuck in a post-industrial rut, focusing for decades now on ensuring strong household consumption. The American right has tended to focus on growing the market to do so, while the left has tended to focus on redistributing its winnings, though there does seem to be a realignment afoot. To my mind, our politics and markets should instead focus on centering the household, as Aristotle well thought they should. And so we'll soon look at what the Greek philosopher had to say about the rightful place of the household in a good politics and in relation to markets. His view that cultivating the human virtues is the most excellent shared household work. And finally, how the virtue of practical wisdom is the integrator, or as it's been called, the mother of all the human virtues. And to my mind, it's among the virtues in which we all need more practice today. But before I get to Aristotle's thinking about the politics and economics and virtues of the household, let me spend a bit of time wrestling with the problem of male normativity, which he also seemed to have introduced in the West. Okay, so this all important, if too brief, step in my presentation this afternoon is necessary because Aristotle's observations about women have made many of his key insights less accessible to us than they might be. So I'm now going to try to thread a very small needle by decoupling his apparent views of women from his insights about the virtues and the household. If this is too much too fast, it's the subject of much recent work of mine, which I collect on this presentation's very last slide. So what I want to do is turn Aristotle against Aristotle, as the late and great philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre said he was doing as he rehabilitated the study of virtue ethics in our time. This is a two-step process of correction, to my mind. One, that first fully includes women in Aristotle's definition of what it is to be human, and two, that then expands our understanding of what it is to be human because it now includes women. This process of correction is not one I'm doing here on the spot. It's one I've discerned in the work of older female thinkers who correct his account of women, but from within his own basic framework. Again, it's a framework that commends the virtues for human flourishing and that sees the household as the place where the virtues should first be cultivated. Okay, so important scholarly attention has been brought over the last several decades to Aristotle's writings about women. And for good reason. They've had a powerful influence over the philosophical and theological traditions of the West and really beyond as well. So let's briefly take a look, very briefly here. In the Politics, Aristotle states that the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled, and this principle of necessity extends to all mankind. This norm of male rule in all arenas is enough to make some modern scholars and students, of course, ignore his work altogether. But there's more, and the connection among all these remains uncertain. Aristotle writes in his Generation of the Animals that females are misbegotten or deformed males, since the female embryo is created in his primitive observations of human biology when human reproduction doesn't go quite right. And then to these moral and biological assertions can be added a third, that women's reason, he says, lacks authority. So, though a human being with a distinctive human capacity to reason, and necessary to the human species for rather obvious reasons, females, in one way or another, lack. Now, there's been voluminous debate over the millennia about what Aristotle says about each of these and all of them together. But I think it's fair to say with a good measure of confidence the following. Aristotle sees the male as the norm at the pinnacle of humanity, as the sex generally more capable of the virtues he commends. The male, then, for Aristotle, is the superior sex, both in terms of his superior capacity for authoritative reason, but also because of the male's superior embodied form. The female form of humanity, that sex that reproduces inside itself, is, in Aristotle's account, the lesser human form. And yes, I do believe, in light of the male normativity I mentioned earlier, that there's a way in which modern Western societies tend, alas, to agree. And yet, these errors as to women's inferior status were corrected a long time ago by some of the earliest advocates of women's equal dignity. As such, they expressly rejected the male normative account. The 15th century thinker Christine de Pizan and the 18th century thinker Mary Wollstonecraft, for instance, both argued in their time that females, or those who have the capacity for motherhood, are no less capable of living in accord with their reason and cultivating the virtues too. These women corrected Aristotle from within a Christian frame on the basis that men and women were both made equally in God's image. And so, like other notable Christian scholars, they Christianized the Aristotelian virtue framework inherited by the West. In my view, both Pizan and Wollstonecraft, and we could add others, prepared the way for the 19th century advocates to make their moral and legal appeals. This is because these thinkers first included women in Aristotle's definition of what it is to be human. Women were, in their shared account, fully rational and responsible creatures whose full flourishing depends on cultivating the virtues. And then they blasted through his male normativity by arguing that women's life-giving capacity for childbearing and breastfeeding and the existential relationality and interdependence it represents were part of what it is to be fully human too. But even as they offered corrections, both these women worked from key Aristotelian principles we'll turn to next: the centrality of the household in a good polity, and personal and societal happiness as the fruit of virtuous activity. And like us, they each wrote in the midst of world transformative revolutions in which women's equal dignity was specially threatened. Pizan's work at the end of the Middle Ages beautifully showcases the great economic and civic contribution and personal agency of women of all classes within the medieval economy, despite masculine exclusiveness in guilds and the like. Wollstonecraft, for her part, saw the threat of a new liberal regime that promised to elevate liberty, equality, and fraternity without recognizing women as fully rational, responsible, and potentially maternal beings. This is all to say that if we are to retrieve Aristotle's insights about the household for our day, which I will now suggest we should, his thought ought to be accompanied by these female thinkers like these two. Okay, so by now you've discerned that for Aristotle and those who follow him, the household is the primary human community, the first necessary society, comprised not only of parents and children, but in his time of extended family and non relative live in relations as well. As such, it was, and would continue to be until industrialization the largest sphere of society in the West. Aristotle observed that the household comes into being for the needs of a couple's daily life and relies upon the interdependent cooperation among its members to provide for its internal needs. Ideally, as I'll soon discuss, its highest end, because also the highest end of each human being who comprises it, is the cultivation of virtue and friendship among the household's members. Importantly, this includes at best the virtuous friendship of the man and woman at the center of it, who as such desire the highest good of the other and all others, whose children are their union's common bond. Though of primary importance for Aristotle, the household was yet an imperfect society. That is to say, it was relatively self-sufficient, but not wholly so. For its own full flourishing, the household needs a community of other households. And it also needs the common goods, think peace, security, and stability most obviously, that only the polis can provide. Indeed, in his view, the polis was the highest or more perfect form of association because it could make up for the household's insufficiencies. That is to say, the political sphere was duly responsible for providing that which households and its members needed to flourish. In a word, for providing for the common good. What strikes us immediately about Aristotle's political thought is that we hear not first of autonomous individuals, markets, or governments, as we're wont to think about actors in our time. We hear first about the household, with the rest of life, politics, and markets aimed at its members' highest end, virtuous activity, including virtuous friendships at its very core. And so, with that brief summary, which I will now break down into parts, let me move to the first principle I want to call from his work for our times. Markets ought to remain ancillary to and in service of households, not the other way around. Aristotle, in his Politics, makes an important distinction between householding, or productivity in the household for use, production for use, and wealth getting, or what he calls unnatural production for gain. Now, he knows that what he calls the art of acquisition is necessary to managing the household. Its members must either find or produce the necessities of life, or even trade necessities with others in a market exchange with them. As he says, some have too little and others too much. But there is a species of wealth getting, of increasing money without limit, of producing for mere profit motive or gain that is improper. It's improper or unfitting for human happiness in that it originates in those who are intent upon living only and not upon living well. That's a quote from the Politics, intent upon living only and not upon living well. To summarize, markets, money, and profits should remain ancillary to the household and in service of its internal goods. They are a means by which households can find the necessities of life. And because they are secondary in this way, they certainly ought not distract from the household's higher purpose, which is to live well. Another phrase which takes on an entirely different meaning in our time from his. For him, he meant living well was cultivating the human excellences, especially of friendship, which are for Aristotle the building blocks of a happy, fulfilling life. But to recall, the industrial era's movement of productive remunerative work out of the household and its transformation over time from chief producer to chief consumer put enormous earnings pressure on its members from the outside. In this way, the household was subordinated to the market. And remunerative work offered from outside the household now takes, indeed, usually must take for mere survival, priority above all else. This is why balancing work and family today feels as though family, friendship, and the other goods of life are to fit into the cracks left from wage or salaried labor. Market work is king. And make no mistake, the prioritization of wealth getting for consumption in the post industrial age has had an enormous impact on gender relations too. Consider it historically first. Child-rearing wives in the industrial era became economically dependent upon their wage-earning husbands because those husbands had become economically dependent upon the industrial capitalists who were, through their capital, shaping the market's logic. Rather than maintaining a relative self-sufficiency from the market, the household in our time has become utterly dependent upon, even in some cases subsumed into the market. And so those who devote their time, even a portion of it, to making a home and caring for children are ipso facto economically more vulnerable. But few, I think, see the root cause. Those on the political right today tend to underappreciate this generally feminine vulnerability and so focus on improving male breadwinning. Those on the political left, fully cognizant of the vulnerability to women, tend to underappreciate the complex factors causing it, and so focus instead on female breadwinning. But to really get at the problem, the focus to my mind should be on placing the modern household at the center of our politics as the first necessary society, with other institutions in support of its important work. And this takes us to principle 2. The most important work of the household for Aristotle is the cultivation of the human virtues, or the formation of excellent human beings. For him, human excellence is the path to human happiness. So Aristotle describes the work of the household as, number 1, that which is servile or deteriorating of the body. Number 2, illiberal, or that kind of least in need of excellence. And number 3, the excellent, that which is needed to live well. So though servile and illiberal work are crucial aspects of the household, that which is necessary to living, the household's most important work is cultivating the virtues of its members so that they may live well. It's important at this point to clearly state what Aristotle and Pizan and Wollstonecraft too meant by virtue. Virtue in the Aristotelian tradition is cultivated, that is, learned and practiced habits of good character. These stable dispositions or excellences of soul enable and empower a person to freely choose and act in accord with that which is good. The virtue of courage empowers one to choose well in the face of danger or fear. The virtue of temperateness, to enjoy the pleasures of life without slavish excess or complete denial. The virtues, and he of course adds many more, allow us to live freely according to the highest principle in us, our reason, rather than to give in slavishly to our fears or desires. Importantly, human flourishing, genuine happiness, is not won through thinking happy thoughts. It's won, Aristotle explains, through virtuous activity, a word he coined that is better translated being at work. So virtuous or humanly being at work. That is to say that cultivating the virtues in oneself and one's children and enjoying friendships of virtue, that is aiming toward real goods together, is the highest kind of human work. It's personal work that offers human beings the interior freedom and stable disposition to do in this moment the good that we ought. But consider again the totally different connotation of the word work in our day, also a consequence of all we've been discussing. With the industrializing rift between work and home, market-based wage labor became the prototype of work. Work became masculine coded, productive, wage earning. To put simply, that activity which earns a wage. Home became feminine coded, caregiving, and today often consumed by consumption. As we've discussed, women lost the remunerative work they had long accomplished alongside the nurture and formation of children, which was also their work and their husbands too. But all work, the work of the household, the work of care, and remunerative work, all these activities of humanly being at work, provide the means, the daily fodder for cultivating the human virtues, for becoming fully human, capable of forming deep friendships. In a word, they make us capable of giving of oneself magnanimously, one of Aristotle's favorite virtues, in generous service to others. Those child sized jobs in and around the household provide the means to cultivate the virtues in children too. Virtues that I found in raising my own children this way empower them to govern themselves, to become the courageous agents of their own lives, capable of deep friendships as well. But even as these virtues and so many others are important to human beings' freedom for excellence, there's yet another that is the mother of them all, the virtue of practical wisdom. Learning to recognize and cultivate practical wisdom, once called prudence, is the final principle, and practice too, that I'd like to cull from Aristotle for our time. Practical wisdom is the learned capacity to discern what is right and good and just in the concrete and particular of this very moment. It's what might be called, what I like to call, heeding the duty of the moment. Consider first the way in which practical wisdom was more easily cultivated in the pre modern age. Subsistence agrarian living demanded creative agency to respond to what the particular moment required. And now milking the cow, now feeding the child, now crafting the cheese. This virtue is also today why I think we see so many women with young children, mostly women with young children, choose flexibility in their jobs over higher pay. They wish to wisely determine which of their competing duties needs tending to in the here and now, at different stages of their children's lives. I say we give this human excellence its ancient name. But more than that, I think we can do a much better job in our post industrial age, not only understanding that inclination toward more flexible remunerative work, but also of encouraging the practice of this virtue for both women and men. We can do this by giving priority in our workplace policies and our politics to that still essential work of the household, the work of cultivating the virtues we all need to be free, responsible, and happy agents of our own lives. We can do this by giving each household the autonomy to discern what is best for its members with their circumstances, their gifts, their needs, their desires. Though he obviously strongly differentiated work by gender in the pre industrial household, I think we can appropriate Aristotle's principle for our own, that men and women in the household, as he put it, help each other by throwing their peculiar gifts on the common stock. Practical wisdom in our day then requires encouraging and supporting each member's peculiar gifts for the household's common good. It governs how members of each household determine together how to carry out the ever-changing responsibilities in the home, sharing its labors, be they servile, illiberal, or excellent. And part of the beauty of practical wisdom is that though we should all look to exemplars, those whose lives we admire, each household and all the members within it must be practically wise in their very own way. Seen in this vein, the decades long mommy wars of working moms and at home moms could simply cease to be. I'm claiming something big right now. And how could this be so? Well, I think many mothers, and indeed some fathers too, recognize, though probably not in these terms, that their own peculiar gifts suit them well toward the traditional household work. The work of contracting, this is how I'm defining that traditional household work, the work of contracting the household's market needs, of limiting its dependence on the modern market. Indeed, we see in our time profound interest in relearning the arts and crafts and skills of homemaking, and not only among social media's right-coded trad wives. I went to college in Vermont 30 years ago, and a movement kind of away from a culture of consumption toward, buying local and growing local and all that was well underfoot and leaned politically left. My own observation of these households, right and left, is that they understand themselves to be economically interdependent. And the homemaker's work is often as much, if not more, highly valued than that of the wage earning spouse. Law and politics should do more to support the practical wisdom of these households. Some parents, however, recognize in themselves far fewer personal gifts and aptitudes toward those traditional homemaking skills, and far more capacity to generate the kinds of goods and services that modern markets are willing to pay for. But this work, too, the kind of work that is paid, the kind that most modern households have to rely upon, must also, it seems to me, be subordinated to, or perhaps better integrated with, that most excellent human work of cultivating the virtues in ourselves and in others. Yet a more authentic integration will only be possible if we begin to see living well as a humane path to freedom and happiness, with wealth getting a means for living, not its end. Only then will our politics and workplaces give the first locus of that most essentially, culturally essential activity, the household and its diversely gifted members, the pride of place it deserves. As Aristotle, Pizan, and Wollstonecraft all saw so well, the goods of the household and the friendships rightly cultivated within them are the basis of civic friendship, and so too of every other political, economic, and social good. Thank you. That's all. Let
Thank
me
you
just
very much, Erika. That's so much to think about, so much to think about.